Welcome to the Lorecast. I'm Dr. Craig Chalkwist, and we're looking at the stories by which we deeply live. Well, I got some sad news this week that I wanted to talk about. The closure of Schumacher College in England. It was a highly transformative school with a set of programs for all kinds of things connected with training students to be mentors at different aspects of work with earth and land and nature and place, all in service to helping us have conscious relationships with all that and with our animal and insect kindred, all kinds of great programs. And I had the honor several years ago of teaching a week-long class at Schumacher. And there was a day that we went out on Dartmoor to do all kinds of nature practices, and we had an ecologist with us who co-taught that part of the class. And that would be Stephen Harding, who was so brilliant and knowledgeable and funny. He had that dry British sense of humor that so many of us love. And of course, he's written books on all this. He was one of the contributors to Gaia Theory. He worked with James Lovelock, and he died recently too. So he was hugely instrumental in getting Schumacher College going. Now, it seems to me we're in a trend where transformative schools are going under, and we've been in this trend for several years. So some years back, when I was a department chair at the California Institute of Integral Studies, I was chair of East-West Psychology, and a Chinese tech company bought out ITP, the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, and they did it in such a way that they stranded about 25 to 30 PhD doctoral candidates with no dissertation advisors because most of the faculty were fired. A lot of the administrators were too. So my program got permission from our regulators to accept a number of those students into the program and not force them to pay huge amounts of money, which they already had paid, to repeat classes and all that. And then they graduated with our credentials after completing their PhD work. So I was very happy we were able to do that for them. Since then, I've been hearing about or involved with a number of other schools that went under. I taught in the feminist psychotherapy track at the New School of California in San Francisco, which went under largely because of fiscal mismanagement. Argosy University went under. I taught there for a semester. And now, most recently, there's a consciousness studies program that will end in January 2025. And so, once again, I'm trying to work out a deal, me and a whole team of people at National University, to bring in 25 to 30 master's students this time to allow them to graduate with our degree. I'm the program director of consciousness, psychology, and transformation, so they could get that degree when they finish a few classes, not too many. So this keeps happening, and it's really making me wonder whether deep studies, consciousness studies, depth studies are viable in higher ed at all. I'm a graduate as well as a former executive of Pacifica Graduate Institute, which right now is having a very public civil war between several sides. The Alumni Association, some counseling students, faculty, administrators, the president, and there's a lot of conflict going on there. My hope is that they'll settle it and move forward, but still it raises the question, are we heading into a time where those kinds of deep studies just can't make it in higher ed? So far, my program's doing okay, but it just makes me wonder, too, whether people who want to study those things would be better served by institutions that are not under the constraints of higher ed. And by that, I mean all kinds of regulatory hoops that you have to jump through, hordes of people assessed with learning outcomes and having to quantify all that. It takes an enormous amount of energy away from teaching transformative material to students. In my program, we've even been told by course designers that we shouldn't be using books more than 5 years old. Can you imagine trying to teach Freud or Jung? So, of course, we push back against that. But I think it's only a matter of time before those kinds of deep studies are so quantized and so rubricized, to use a word that Abraham Maslow coined, that very little that's transformative can even leak through. That seems to be the trend in American education, and other countries are getting on the bandwagon too, unfortunately. And I keep thinking about how in past times, when some of the universities that taught classical learning closed, then the monasteries opened and preserved some of the learnings there. And so over the last 20 years, I've had the honor of teaching with many exemplary deep teachers of various kinds in many different disciplines. And I know a number of them who simply retired ahead of time because they couldn't take all the quantification, all the rules, all the procedures, and all the rest of it. They just got sick of it. They said, this isn't what I signed up for. I signed up to be a teacher, not a computer. And so they left. And so the fantasy that I keep having, and I'm really curious what you think about this, is that somehow a lot of those people who are still willing to teach could be brought together in some kind of a school that would not offer degree programs, but it would offer certificates and classes and other kinds of resources. And it would teach to being able to apply those learnings, those deep learnings, so many of them. And I don't just mean mindfulness and work with ritual and ceremony and things like that, although those would be included. But all the terrapsychology I've taught over the years to help people reconnect with the presence of place, and personal myth classes. And, there's a whole piece on the Jungian side about archetypes that show up in current events. And consciousness studies is itself a multidisciplinary field with many different perspectives, some of them scientific. So I'm fantasizing about a school with instructors who are experts on different aspects of that, which I look at as bits and pieces, puzzle pieces maybe, of the need for a planetary mythology. And I don't mean mythology in the sense of literal, for instance, gods and sacred books and all that stuff. That's mythology in the old style. I mean reinterpreting the old stories as fiction and performance and social justice issues and all kinds of present learning, vocational, workplace. I teach a class at National University on fairy tale motifs that pop up in the workplace. There's all kinds of ways of dealing with this deeply mythic material that serves current needs. So when people say the humanities aren't practical, I just laugh. I can't think of anything more practical. The humanities teach us what stories we're caught in, and they inquire into what kinds of values we should have and whether they're conscious or not, and what our goals should be and how to live with each other and how to live on the planet together. We keep redoing the same old conflicts to the extent that we don't learn about them. And that, of course, is an insight that comes from philosophers, psychologists. I'm thinking of Santayana and Freud and Jung and a bunch of other people have pointed this out, all on the side of the humanities. In my second PhD dissertation, I looked at how imagination as a means of knowing, not an entertaining add-on, a means of knowing is treated throughout the history of Western philosophy. There's some really rich contributions. Some by people I didn't expect to have made them. And of course, that's not confined to the West. If you spent months or even years studying Neo-Confucian writings about ethics, it would be time well spent. And there's many other examples of the rich learning that's available. That could be practically applied today because it's relevant. I've been telling people online and social media, if you want to understand the rise of authoritarianism, which has always been present in the United States, but now it's flaming hot, Then you need to read about authoritarian personality and the work of Erich Fromm and the New School for Social Research. These are all learnings that apply today. In philosophy, Cornel West writes about the imagination as prophetic and pragmatic and how it can make actual change in the world. There's a number of voices working on similar things. So what if we had this? It would be a school that offers, as I said, certificates rather than degrees, because to offer degrees, you have to go through this painful accreditation, years-long process. And then that would mean, of course, student loans in most schools for the degrees to even be reputable. Then you get into things like transfer credits and whether, if you let's say you were in a master's degree, will it help launch you into a PhD at a different school, and all those complicated questions. So we're just going to avoid all that. A school that's a nonprofit. There are schools I worked at that were for-profits, and it really got in their way. Or they call themselves employee-owned schools. And the problem here, a big problem here, is that they can't take donations. So they're heavily dependent on tuition, which means they're constantly driving to get students in. So instead, we have a nonprofit school. And lots of different diverse instructors, which would translate into a diverse body of, I don't know what we would call them, students, learners, participants, future mentors, future influencers, people who actually make a difference out in the world. In quiet ways or very public ones. And although there would be many things that the school and its curriculum would focus on, consciousness studies and depth psychology and feminist studies and a number of things. But the guiding principle or lodestar, whatever you want to call it, would be how to transform our deep stories, the guiding stories by which we live, individually and collectively, into something more spacious, more humane, more just, more delightful, more enchanted. All in service to building the kind of world that we want to live in, a world that's run by adults, rather than 5-year-olds in adult bodies. So that would be a long-range vision of this school, how to grow humanity up, how to come of age as a species, which is something I write about in my fiction as well. And there would be an arts and fiction study component to all this. So it has to be. Creativity would be one of the core emphases. Now, I've used a number of terms over the years to gather all this together. A recent term that I continue to use is loreology. It's the study of what we use for lore. What crucial guiding fictions, what mythic motifs, what archetypal themes keep coming up in how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to our other people, how we relate to the planet. And where do those need expanding or even moving beyond? That's what loreology deals with. I've been doing it for more than 20 years. Another term I use for that is restorying. Restorying. And so that would be a term for the kinds of learners that we would want to produce at this school. Encourage and launch into the world. Restoriers. They would be culture mentors. They would be deep educators. Worldview therapists. Our therapists badly need worldviews that are adequate to what they do as healers, and our worldviews themselves need therapy. So these would be new kinds of storytellers, not just repeating the old stories, although they might choose to do that, but allowing us to become aware of bigger possibilities to move into. Now, one of the difficulties of doing something like this, and there are many, is how to pay the instructors. So as a former administrator, I can tell you that when you work at an institute that doesn't use student loans, then it's harder to get people to show up. And when they do show up, you can't charge them as much. So 2 of the institutes I've been involved with as an adjunct instructor that went out of business said, okay, we're going to charge our students per quarter unit, per semester unit, whatever. do according to your school schedule, we're going to charge about half. So a school might charge anywhere from $700 to $1,000 for one unit of, let's say, a 3-unit class. So half that, as low as maybe $200. And of course, it brings up other questions like why use units at all? Why be on a quarter or on a semester? Certificates tend not to conform to that, and they tend to be way more affordable. So what has to happen is there needs to be enough people coming in that are interested in this, and perhaps enough donations as well, to make something like this economically feasible. And that means there would be a need to promote it and a need to show the practical applications of how transformative this kind of work really is, which it is. Then there's the question of campuses. So at first, an organization like this might have, let's say, a central office that physically exists, maybe. But I'm imagining a hybrid program where some of the learning would be online, including Zoom sessions. You have to have them. One of the programs that went underwater stopped having required Zoom sessions, and so the students never really got to know each other as presences and never did dream work together, things like that, myth work. So, of course, they weren't interested in showing up. So we would really emphasize participation. So one component would be online, including regular video sessions. And then another component would be something like renting out a retreat center so that students could show up either at the beginning or at the end of the certificate or both and interact in person with the instructors and with each other. There was a school I worked for where a number of instructors tried to sell that idea to the administrators, but they were locked into the idea that a school has to have a campus. And so they said no. And they were stuck in a building that was 100 years old, falling apart, and paying exorbitant amounts of money to keep it maintained and up to code. So I'm open to the idea of a campus, but that would be down the road. If something like this really took off, then sure, why not a campus? But for now, the campus would be relationships. So notice how in the history of religion, for example, there's been a movement in that direction. So at first it was all about temples and rituals and the priests and all that. And then over time, temples got destroyed and religion shifted a little bit and said, it's not really about the temples anymore and not even about sacred ground. It's about books. It's about a holy book. It's about the law and the commandments and things like that. And now religion is shifting again. Not just in terms of putting us more in touch with the world wherever we are, but religion, and I'm thinking of Church of the Wild in particular, is saying, look, spirit's not a scarcity resource. It's everywhere so that we can access it anywhere. So how do we do it? Through nature practices, through imagination, through our relationships with each other. And so I think education could learn a lot from that. We have to remember, too, that a school is more than buildings. It's more than what we usually associate it with. It's more than books, for instance. It should include learnings and may include buildings, but the school is all of us. The school is a community of deep learners. That's what really counts. And we have to remember as well that whatever is underneath all this, whatever is lurking behind imagination, behind image, behind consciousness, deep learnings, and all the rest of it, we could just be like the Gnostics, for instance, and call it depth with a capital D. Bythos was their word for it. Whatever that is, it wants to be known. It wants to be studied. It wants to animate what we do in the world. It wants to be expressed through learnings, through thought, through creativity, through ritual, through many different kinds of practices, through film, performance, you name it. Whatever it is that animates us and the world and the cosmos wants and needs to be expressed. And the need for that will never go out of fashion, and it will never fail, because in the end, it's the glue that holds the whole cosmos together. So why not build some kind of a learning center that knows that and that's able to work with that as it unfolds in the cycle of the seasons, in the movement of animals, in our bodies, and everywhere else, in the very breaths that we take. Why not? Or as I also like to say, what if? Thanks.